We have $1.5 trillion of student debt in the United States right now, something that has never happened before in the history of the United States and does not exist in any other developed country. There's no other developed country in the world that has, in many of them, there's no student debt whatsoever because college is not only free, but in countries like Denmark, they actually give you a stipend of $500 a month to go to college. And I mean, it can be hard to get in because you've got to qualify. You've got to demonstrate you've got the ability to do it. But for people who are not college bound, they have, apprenticeships and things like that. But, why don't we have free college in the United States? Back during when Reagan came into office, 80% of the cost of college was paid for by federal, state, and local governments and university endowments. 20% was paid for by tuition. And that's how I was able to go to college. I didn't graduate, but I was able to go to college working at a gas station and as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy. Pretty much everybody else was able to too back in that day. And now this, after Bill Bennett started reversing things as Reagan's education secretary, now 80% of the cost of college is paid for with tuition, and 20% is essentially subsidized. On the line with us is Charles Sauer, libertarian economist and president of the Market Institute. He's the author of a new book, Profit Motive, What Drives the Things We Do. It came out yesterday. MarketInstitute.org is the website. You can tweet him at Charles Sauer. It's Sauer. Charles, congratulations on the book publishing.
Thanks, and thanks for having me back on.
My pleasure. So if we're going to do away with free college, then why not? Well, first of all, what's your take on free college? Let me get to that.
Well, I don't think that there's such a thing as free college. Even when we talk about some of the countries you mentioned in the intro, college isn't actually free, and the student debt ratio is nearly the same. And when you talk about what a student can possibly make when they get out of college, it's actually worse in a lot of countries. So if we take Sweden, for example, the student to debt ratio there is something, the student debt is something like 85% of the students graduate with debt, and their student to debt ratio is high as well. In the U.S., it's actually lower, even though they're giving away free education. The takeaway here is that free is never free, and that's like an economics 101 lesson for anybody.
Wait a minute. So you can go to college for free in Sweden, but you're telling me that people graduate from college in debt. What is that, just from living expenses, from not earning a living while they're going to college?
Yep, about 100% of the students in Sweden take out student loans or receive grants, but because they have the free student loans, they treat it differently they treat education differently in their family. So most of the students are moving out. In the U.S., a lot of parents are subsidizing some of the living costs. And so we're just switching.
Charles, you're doing a bit of a bait and switch here, because I'm talking about the cost of education and you're talking about the cost of going to school. And those are different things.
You're talking about the part of education that you want to make your argument. I'm actually talking about the full cost of education and what it costs.
Well, that's fine. I get that. And I think everybody is clear that that's what you're talking about. What I'm talking about is the cost of education itself. And as you correctly point out, it's free in Sweden. It's free in pretty much every other developed country in the world. I remember when Louise and I were in Costa Rica, the taxi driver who drove us out to this place where we were shooting for this documentary, from the airport, it was about a 2-hour drive, got a long conversation. I said, what do you think about living in Costa Rica? Oh, I love it. What's great about Costa Rica? My son's graduating from medical school and I'm a taxi driver. How is that? Oh, we have free college here. And I have free health care, and everybody has, because, this is Costa Rica. It's like, I don't get why we can't do that. So are you suggesting that we should keep our college system as it is, extraordinarily expensive, with $1.5 trillion of student debt that is all, by the way, paying, or probably the vast majority of it, paying for tuition, because that's pretty much the only thing you can get many student loans for is tuition. It's not, or tuition and books at the most, but you can't, get student loans to pay for the cost of, and as you correctly point out, a lot of these people, particularly young people, live at home.
I'm not saying that. And if you really look at the graphs on where the student tuition prices started increasing, this is something you again mentioned in the intro. They start increasing at the same time that the government started coming in and taking a part in education and taking a part of the expenses. And the schools are.
Wait a minute, Charles. California had free college up until Ronald Reagan became president. There were no student loans then. I went to college in the 60s, in the late 60s, 1967, 68, and I have no recollection of anybody other than one friend of mine who was in a master's program who had any student loans at all. I mean, nobody ever discussed it. Nobody ever even thought of it.
Yep, and the government hadn't fully taken over the student loan market at that time, right?
There was no student loan market at that point. But back to my question. So are you saying
we have the government involved in the student loan market and what's
so?
If
you don't want the government involved, then again, you're changing the subject. I'm not talking about the cost of living when you're going to school, and I'm not talking about the student loan market. I'm talking about the cost of education, the cost of college, and I'm suggesting that one of the things that we know from the GI Bill, our experience with the GI Bill, and we can actually just look at any other country, but one of the things that we know is that every tax dollar that we spent educating, sending to college people like my dad and my wife's dad, every dollar that we spent as a country, we got back $7 additional in tax revenue we wouldn't have had because those people earned more and therefore paid more in taxes than they would have earned had they not been college graduates. So we know that this is not an expense. This is an investment that returns a 700% return on investment. Why wouldn't we tomorrow morning say, okay, that's it. The cost of tuition, and all we're talking about here is tuition. The cost of tuition is now zero. We are going to fully subsidize this. Why not do that?
See, you blame me for changing the argument, but then you add in a little subgroup, and this is not a little subgroup. I'm sorry. You add in one of the best subgroups to get a number from, the GI Bill. That is totally picking the numbers. You admitted at the beginning that Denmark
it was 8 million people.
Students.
That's a huge cohort if you're doing statistical analysis.
Cherry picking of students. The fact is if you do free universal education, it's not universal education. It ends up being the smartest and the most elite that get in, and the people with the most crony connections. And that's why the left wants it, because they're going to create the power.
Okay, so if you want to prevent there from being free college for all, or for anybody who can qualify to get in, if you want to prevent that, do you want to do away with K through 12 too? Right now we have free K through 12. It's state sponsored. You want to do away with that, like Betsy DeVos does?
Just like your trip overseas, I've had many cab rides over here where the father is paying for the student to go to college in the U.S. and he's happy that he immigrated here. In fact, one of my last neighbors, it has his kids going.
Do you want to end free public? You don't want to have free public colleges in the United States. And by the way, that's the proposal that's made by most progressives, including Bernie, is not all colleges have to be free, but just publicly owned institutions, the University of Michigan kind of thing, or Michigan State, But are you then, again, I'll ask the question, if you think that the state shouldn't be funding education above the 12th grade, do you think that the state should be funding education below the 12th grade?
I've seen a lot of good arguments that say that it shouldn't. I'm not going to go and make that my policy stance at this point, because just like Ocasio-Cortez jumping the boat and not understanding that there needs to be some sort of progress to get us off of oil before we just start burning all the trees in the world. The fact is we can't go from where we're at to a private system tomorrow. It's something that would take thought.
Well, this is what Betsy DeVos is doing. I mean, in Michigan now, over half the schools are private charter schools. They've privatized education in Michigan, largely as a consequence of the efforts of her and the people associated with her foundation and her family. It's multi-billion-dollar, and she's now proposing $6 billion for more charter schools all around the United States, due to what they did to Michigan, do it to the rest of the United States. And as a consequence, public schools in Michigan, in many places, are collapsing essentially. So what I'm hearing you say is that you'd like to get there, but you want to make a transition. You don't want to just pull the plug tomorrow.
No, I'm saying that it's worthwhile to look at. And if you're following your examples from the GI Bill, the numbers I've seen from the charter schools seem to mimic that. If students come out better prepared, that the investment in a charter school seems to be a better investment. So I understand your use of the GI Bill, and I'm glad that you're using it, but you should apply the same idea in the same conclusions to the charter schools. It's one of the problems with the left is there's too many arguments to keep track of, so they don't make sense when you run them at each other. But the charter school argument is the same as the GI Bill.
Charter schools do not have better outcomes than public schools do, Charles. There's no shortage of studies showing that. In many cases, they have far worse outcomes. And the biggest consequence of private, particularly for-profit charter schools, is that they gut the public schools, particularly when they pick and choose who they can take. And the public schools end up with the most expensive students to teach without the resources. And everybody says, oh, it should be the same. And it's not. I mean, this is.
I have seen the research on both sides here, and every time I've seen one that's come out against charter schools, it seems to be skewed in multiple ways. And the ones that say that the charter schools are producing the better students seem to be the ones with the good research.
So families should be taking out loans to send their kids to fifth grade in addition to college.
Look, as long as we have a better debt to income ratio than the countries that give out free education, then the answer is yes.
Wow.